All right. Our final module, we're going to be talking about some big stuff going on right now in the history of psychology. History is going on right now, if you don't realize. Many of the events I'm going to be talking about happened over the past 10 years, maybe 20 years tops, but these events are still ongoing and they still matter and they affect your career as a psychologist in ways that I'm going to try to make perfectly clear. So, this is part one. I'm going to talk about the replication crisis. And then in part two, I'm going to talk about big data and machine learning and stuff like that. So, the replication crisis, like the name says, mostly pertains to the fact that we now are starting to realize more and more that many classic psychology experiments don't replicate. When you try to repeat those studies, you don't get the same results. um, I guess this is a better label for the crisis than the fraud crisis, but as you'll see, the problem is not that a bunch of scientists were doing honest work and were discovering things that just coincidentally don't happen to replicate. What's happening is that people were doing dishonest things, maybe consciously, maybe not. You can defend them if you want to. I think some people deserve some defense, some people don't. Why this matters to you is that if you're going to be a clinician, a counselor, or provide some kind of psychological service, that service or that practice has to be based on evidence. If it's not based on evidence, then you're a fraud. You're wasting people's money. You're wasting people's time and hopes on something that is not proven to work. And if it's not proven to work, why are you billing insurance companies for it? You owe it to your clients to provide them something that is legitimate. So if you are basing your services on evidence, then you don't want that evidence to be fraudulent. You want to be helping people based on legitimate evidence. So the earliest point on the timeline is 2005. A article was published, and it was kind of a harbinger to this whole crisis. It's the first time this started appearing in print. This was a Greek researcher named John Ioannidis, and he published a very spicy essay called "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." And he argued that if you look at the published record of all these findings, these statistically significant findings, there is a statistically significant correlation between variable X and variable Y. The control group, the placebo group, there's a statistically significant difference between that control group or placebo group and some new treatment. Well, if you look at how many statistically significant findings are in the literature, and then you apply some basic statistical assumptions, you can infer that most of the findings that are reported that are statistically significant must be mistaken. Just statistically, there can't be that many uh, findings that pass the threshold for statistical significance. If you've taken a statistics class, especially if you've taken Psychology 2525 here at LSUA, it might be worth your time to go take a glance at this article because it talks about things you would be familiar with by now, such as type 1 errors and type 2 errors. Um, his assumptions or his model of how the situation works are not perfect. You can debate them. Suffice it to say, this was kind of something that was thrown into the mix, and a lot of things got a lot of people thinking, got a lot of people worried. Um, Not too long after that, in 2011, there was this giant in the field, Daryl Bem. You may not have heard of him before, but most of the findings that you learn in introductory psychology or in counseling psychology, developmental psychology, you know, we don't stop and make sure that you know every single person's name who had a big influence on where our theories are coming from and where our treatments are coming from. But Bim was a big deal, is a big deal. He was a professor emeritus at Cornell University. He also taught at Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, and Harvard. His work was cited over 15,000 times, and these were some of these publications that were cited so much were in top tier journals. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk a lot about top tier journals because this is very important to the problem. So, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, JPSP, is one of the biggest journals in the field of psychology. If you publish something in JPSP, that can make your career, that opens up certain doors. You won't be considered for certain jobs in academia if you're going to be a faculty member, if you're going to be a researcher. Many people who are great clinicians are also on faculty at a university, and if you lack publications in these top tier journals, then you won't be considered because other people that are competing for that job will have these. So anyway, Bim he published an article in JPSP that quote unquote proved that people can sometimes detect future events. Now, this was very surprising because if you're familiar with the laws of physics, things that happen in the future cannot affect things that happened in the past. That's not how time works. That's not how causation works. So why is this psychology journal publishing results that would contradict our understanding of how the universe works? You'd think that they'd want to really carefully look at this study and make sure it's right. Maybe ask, I don't know, some physicists or something, like, would this even be possible? But JPSP, I'm not super familiar with what exactly the the review process was like. We can discuss that. They published this article, and this raised a bunch of eyebrows. The people were saying, well, how can this be? This would change the way we understand the universe if we could detect things that happen in the future. So some researchers decided, well, let's just do a very basic first step follow-up and just see if we can replicate these findings. And they could not. In fact, many people tried to replicate these findings and could not replicate them. So Bim's study must have been some sort of fluke, and we'll get more into that later. So in Bim's study, he would show you a curtain, and the curtain would open to reveal a picture, and there was either something boring on the other side, a picture of like maybe a glass of water or a filing cabinet, and sometimes there was a pornographic picture. And you pick curtain number 1 or curtain number 2. Well, 49.8% of the time, people would choose a curtain. They don't know what's behind each curtain. They would choose the boring object. But 53.1% of the time, if they had a chance to pick the pornographic picture, they'd pick it. So there's a slight statistical edge if there was going to be something pornographic, if that was even a choice, hidden behind one of the curtains. That would be something they would see. This was a big media sensation. As you can see in this screenshot right here, Stephen Colbert talked about time-traveling porn. There was also, Bim also did a study where he would say, you study a bunch of words, you recall as many of them as you can, and then you view 20 words at random. Some of them were reviewed from the list that you originally studied, some were not, and participants were more likely to remember words that, how to put this? So basically, if you were going to review, it's so confusing. If you were going to eventually see these words again and review, you were going to remember them anyway. So I give you some words to study. Uh, and then I ask you to remember as many as you can. The ones that we were later going to remind you of, you were more likely to recall before we reminded you of them. It's so confusing. And the reason why I think these are such confusing experiments is because there's something called p-hacking, which I'm going to talk about later. Usually, when you run a statistical test, there's a 5% chance that you're going to make what's called a type 1 error. That's where you're inferring that there's some kind of effect, like a tendency to pick the curtain with the pornographic image, or there's a tendency to remember some words before you see them as part of the reminder list. Usually, you have a 5% chance of concluding that there's an effect when there really is not an effect. However, with p-hacking, if you do the planned statistical test and you don't see the effect you predicted, then you can test your prediction in different ways. And you can actually, if your first study doesn't give you the prediction that you wanted, you can run another similar study. Or you can go look back at your data and say, okay, well, maybe they didn't pick words that maybe they didn't guess that certain words were going to appear on the list that they haven't seen yet, but maybe they're more likely to study. You could find so many ways to test your hypothesis in the data, or change your hypothesis to be a different version of your previous hypothesis. The more that you ask questions of your data, the more likely that you're going to see a statistical fluke. If you run a bunch of studies that are very similar to each other, eventually you're going to see an effect that's not real, because that's how Lady Luck works. That's why we use statistical methods, is that we want to reach conclusions that are probably true, but that's why it's important to replicate studies. And that's why it's important not to keep pulling the lever at the slot machine and hope you win the jackpot of some remarkable coincidence happening, and then try to publish that coincidence as if that's a typical thing to happen when it's not. And that's probably what Daryl Bem did. And his paper has been retracted, but JPSP was very reluctant to engage in this process. A lot of journals, it's bad public relations. It's bad for your image if you print a retraction, so JPSP didn't want to do it. Also in 2011, there was another social psychologist, Diederik Stapel. Interestingly, he was studying acting before he switched to psychology. But once he got into psychology, he eventually published 58 articles. 58 of his articles were retracted from prestigious journals such as JPSP, which I've talked about. Psychological Science is a very prestigious journal in psychology. And just like with JPSP, there are certain jobs you just won't be considered for if you don't have a publication in psychological science, because that's sort of a prestigious badge of honor to be published in such a great journal. An even bigger honor is to be published in a journal called Science. Science isn't just a prestigious journal for psychology, it's prestigious just in general. Their audience consists of neuroscientists, geologists, mathematicians, social scientists of all stripe, economists. It has a very general audience, and arguably is probably one of the top 3 journals that, there's no more prestigious place to get into aside from Science, Nature, and there's a journal called the Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences, or PNAS for short. Those are all top journals, and Staple here had articles retracted from all of these very prestigious places because it turned out that he was publishing fraudulent data. And one thing that should have tipped everyone off is that he collected his own data. If you don't know, at large research-focused universities, your Harvards, your Yales, and whatnot, but even not at the most prestigious ones, like, I went to Texas Tech University for my PhD. It's still a heavy research-focused university. It's no Harvard, but it's still heavy research focus. LSU in our system is a research focused university. When you are the principal investigator, you're the one who's running the show with this study or this research. You are probably not collecting your own data. You're not going to be sitting there recruiting participants and running participants through the procedures and actually writing down what they do and everything. You just design the study. You have your minions go do your study for you, and then they come and bring you the results. So that's not what Staple did, though. He would always collect his own data, supposedly, and that should have really tipped people off because that's very unusual for scientists to just go work by themselves and come back with data. So after suspicions got high, because, this kind of thing just can't last forever, here's a quote, direct quote from Staple himself. He said, instead of collecting the data for his studies, he would sit alone in his, some of this is quote from him. Instead of collecting the data for his studies, he would sit alone in his office or at his kitchen table late into the night, typing the numbers he required for his imaginary results into a spreadsheet, making them all up from scratch. Quote, I did some things that were terrible, maybe even disgusting, he wrote. I faked research data and invented studies that had never happened. I worked alone, knowing exactly what I was doing. I didn't feel anything. No disgust, no shame, no regrets. I invented entire schools where I'd done my research, teachers with whom I'd discussed the experiments, lectures that I'd given, social studies lessons that I'd contributed to, gifts that I'd handed out as thanks for people's participation. So, this is an extreme case of widespread fraud. Now let's go to a different case of fraud. I'm just giving you the highlights. There have been others. Here's this guy, Michael LaCour, not to be confused with Mark LaCour, who was not a fraudster. Michael here was a PhD student at UCLA, and he published a paper on political canvassing. That's when you go out and try and get people to show up and vote on certain issues. And this was a very interesting study about LGBT issues and how to convince people to become more sympathetic and vote in your favor on these issues. The results of this research, they were published in a prestigious journal, and those results were discussed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, LA Times, This American Life, and he had a job waiting for him at Princeton University. And by the way, when he was interviewed later after this was all discovered to be fraudulent, he said he even lied about having funding for this research. And he said, the reason I would lie about not just this research, but other research is, he said, when you do research, but it's not funded, that's not prestigious. And whenever you've earned grant money, like some other committee has decided that has deemed your research worthy of funding, that makes you look prestigious. So he would lie. He would be paying for, or he didn't have any data, but he not only lied about the data, but lied about the data being paid for by an external entity. So yeah, the study ended up being retracted in 2015 because it eventually came out that the data were all fabricated. This LaCour guy just made it all up. He made up. He supposedly had people from the LGBT community go out and collect signatures and ask people things, and they experimentally manipulated certain things about the canvassers. And, he said that he hired this company and the company handled the canvassing, and none of it was true. So here's a guy, he just, he was at a prestigious university, UCLA, earning his degree, and he just wanted to get a real job, a prestigious job, and he had one lined up at Princeton, but he felt like he wouldn't have got anywhere if he didn't look as successful as some of his peers. I don't know if even his peers were this successful, getting this much national attention and getting into such a popular journal. This was in Science, as I said earlier. That's a very prestigious journal. In 2012, there was a famous psychologist, John Bargh, who kind of got uh, found out. He was a professor of psychology at Yale University. He had a famous doctoral mentor, Robert Zients, who's a very big name in social psychology. That's another part of this game is if you're in the mindset of I need to be a success and I need to be a big deal and I need to hype myself up, it kind of becomes an insider game, a kind of political game. When I've gone to conferences, I've heard people bemoan the fact that, well, I wish my advisor was more famous, my PhD advisor. I wish my mentor had more clout. My PhD mentor does not have a bunch of friends on the editorial board of science or psychological science. So this is a big part of the game is being affiliated with the right people. Anyway, Bargh got his first academic gig teaching at NYU, very prestigious university. He published articles in Science, JPSP, American Psychologist, and Psychological Science. And here's a copy of his book, Before You Know It: The Unconscious Reasons We Do What We Do. He primarily studied subliminal priming, and a lot of his research appears in introductory textbooks. Let me see if I have a slide. Yeah. Effects that he discovered and ones like it are along the lines of these studies here. So there's the Macbeth effect, where people aren't consciously aware of this, but if you get people thinking about past misdeeds or make them feel gross in some way about things they've done, or get them to do something that they don't feel too great about, like induce them into like cheating on a test or something, they end up preferring to wash their hands and engage in hygienic behaviors as if their soul is dirty or they need to cleanse themselves. There's also the money priming, and these are all published in prestigious journals. Science is a very prestigious one. The Journal of Experimental Psychology General, it's a very prestigious journal. In the money priming study, he got money on people's mind in subtle ways. Like he'd have some sort of subtle inducement to start thinking about money, and then he would observe, for the control group, he would put people in situations where you watch kids play, or you put people in a game where they can allocate resources. And whenever you get money on people's minds, they start acting more cutthroat, acting all about it, how it's all me, me, me. Probably Bargh's most famous study, and one that I've definitely seen in multiple psychology books, textbooks, and just books released to the popular public, uh, they would track the speed with which people left the study. Now, some people just did some sort of word completion test where there'd be a bunch of like, it would say A blank blank LE, can you finish the word? And you'd think for a second and say, apple. Some people would have normal words like apple, orange, chalk, cheese. Some people would have words mixed in that are semantically similar to being elderly, like gray, old, wrinkle, stuff like that. Now, the people who were primed to think about concepts related to being elderly, when you applied the speedometer to them as they walked down the hall, supposedly they would walk more slowly. See, you've got the idea of being elderly and old subtly primed subconsciously in their minds, so now they're walking slowly down the hall. Um, well, it turns out that none of these studies, or hardly any of them, replicate. And this is despite the fact that this latter study from '96 was cited over 5,000 times. It's proudly described in psychology textbooks and popular psychology books. But in 2012, someone tried to replicate it. They used better technology to track people's speeds and didn't replicate. This is in 2012. And then Bargh released a book on how awesome his work is in 2017 and still talked about all of his body of work as if it's this great, awesome stuff, showing us all kinds of insights into people's subconscious mind and how you can get people subliminally to think of one thing and they'll feel dirty, or like you can get people to walk more slowly if you subtly get them to subliminally think about old people. Barg should have known by the time he wrote this book in 2017 that a lot of these studies have problems, but that didn't stop him. And one of the reasons is it might not necessarily be that this effect is totally made up, but the problem seems to be with this study in particular with the elderly priming and people walking more slowly if they're thinking of elderly people, is that when you run these studies, you need to have double blind control. That means obviously the participants can't know which experimental group that they're in, but also the people collecting the data can't know that either. So if you're collecting data and you know that someone's in the old condition versus the not old condition, so you know that someone is supposed to be walking more slowly this time, that's the expectation, that could have subtle biases in how you record the times. People want to be right. They want to find the results that they're supposed to find. Sometimes researchers will ask undergraduate students to help them collect data, and the undergrad students are told what the expectation is, and then later it turns out the students they thought that they were helping the professor, the researcher, find the results they wanted by kind of skewing things a little bit, like let's throw out this one, let's not turn in this one, but this one's good, maybe add another zero here. um, yeah, so you got to make sure that the people running the study don't know that information. Let's talk about follow-ups. If you recall from a previous module, one of the problems during the post-Enlightenment era, so 1700s, 1800s, early 20th century, all that, um, there were a lot of scams out there. There's a lot of harmful medical procedures that were being tried out, and one of the problems with why these miracle cures and these new procedures would last so long is that uh, people would administer these treatments and they would say, like this person who was tormenting their family by having loud outbursts and engaging in violent, or not violent, but like, erratic behavior. Well, now they're bedridden and kind of spaced out and don't know what's going on. See, my procedure worked. Well, it turned out that your procedure worked in subduing them temporarily, but then you didn't actually address the root cause. You just kind of knocked them out for a week, and then months later they recover and they're back to how they usually are acting. Well, we apparently haven't learned this lesson. So there's this surgeon. I can't speak Italian. Paolo Macchiariani. I don't know. I'm just to call him Paulo. Paulo came out with these trachea transplants that were the result of growing stem cells in a certain way. He was claiming to cure a deadly kind of cancer by removing people's tracheas and replacing them with these synthetic transplants. So he got a prestigious job. If you're a doctor, the Karolinska Institute is, the place you want to be. And he published a lot of papers on the success of this transplant, including The Lancet, one of the top medical journals. Every discipline has its own journals that specialize in and whatnot. He published these papers, kind of spiking the ball, talking about how, here's a case study. I used this transplant and they were cured. He would crank these studies out in these case studies, bragging about how well his cures worked so fast that he kind of missed the fact that his transplants were killing all of his patients. Kind of took a while, and surprisingly, he had to have known that people were dying pretty close to whenever he would do these transplants. Now, maybe he thought to himself, well, their disease was that bad that not even my transplant can save them. But he was definitely rushing out those results, and he knew that there at least could have been a problem because all of his patients were dying. But this guy, Paulo something something something, also seemed to enjoy being a celebrity. He claimed to be the Pope's personal physician, and he would go to fancy red carpet events and whatnot. So thinking maybe there was some ulterior motives. So now the ball's rolling, and this stuff is happening all the time. People are going back and looking and at past studies and saying we need to make sure that everything replicates. We can't be putting out these textbooks and training clinicians and giving advice and seminars and telling police how to interrogate people and telling school counselors how to give advice to children. There's all kinds of services that psychologists provide, and because of this replication crisis, they're looking back and saying, like, we need to go back and reestablish everything at the foundations. Like, we can't take anything for granted anymore. And another victim, you could say it's a victim, you could say casualty of this, is Amy Cuddy, who did research on the so-called power pose. The power pose is when you go and you do this certain pose, like you're Wonder Woman, and supposedly it would do something like hormonally or mentally, and people would be more likely to ace an interview or be successful in some way if they just strike this pose. But like many of the people I'm talking about, there's reason to believe that this researcher had prestige on the mind, or they had perhaps a bit of a drive to satisfy their ego in some way. So Cuddy, she got her PhD from Princeton, and she taught at Harvard and Northwestern, Rutgers, Harvard. Again, she went back and taught at her own at Harvard. Her TED Talk on the power pose is the second most viewed TED Talk, with 73.5 million views as of this writing. It's probably more now, since I haven't updated this particular slide. She released a best-selling New York Times best-selling book called Presence, and she has earned accolades from Time Magazine, Business Insider, Science, Psychological Science, and the World Economic Forum. And like many of the people I'm going to talk about, especially coming up, is even though Cuddy still is an academic, someone who's supposed to be doing research, like objective research, she also gets paid very well to go do speaking engagements and writing, write pieces for the New York Times or whatever. Sadly, her work on the power pose is not replicable. People try to rerun the studies, and again, it seems to be a problem with double blind. The researchers who are collecting the data shouldn't know. If you're about to go give an interview or you're about to go do an interview, the people recording how well you do in the interview should not know if you did the power pose or not. And apparently that was, they don't replicate the results anyway, but the people who didn't replicate it said, hey, maybe it's because of this double blind thing. And I'd be willing to bet that's part of the problem. It is very important that the people recording your data, or the instruments you're using to record the data, have no knowledge. Like, you don't want to be giving off subtle cues. You don't want to be subtly encouraging or discouraging, depending on how you expect or want the results to come out. As people kept digging, one person said, hey, let's go look at this very famous Stanford prison experiment that was done in the 70s. This guy, Philip Zimbardo, back in the 70s at Stanford, he went down into the basement of the psychology building and ran this study. You probably have heard of it if you're a psychology major, but he basically randomly assigned some participants to be guards and other participants to be prisoners, and he did this work on how, look, if you just put people in uniforms and hide their identity, like putting sunglasses, these certain things where you mess with certain dynamics about how one sees themselves in the situation, will encourage brutality and escalation of tense relationships. There was a lot made of the results of this study. But someone said, hey, we're going back and looking at all this research. Let's go back and look at the original transcripts and tapes and all what's left over of the Stanford prison experiment. And basically, they've realized that it's not really an experiment at all, that Zimbardo played down how much he encouraged the participants to act in certain ways. Zimbardo would, the participants weren't taking it seriously, so he'd go tell the prisoners to rebel and enrage the guards. He'd go tell the guards to keep them in line and don't be afraid to hit them. Zimbardo saw that nothing was happening, so he kind of went and pushed and said, look, we need something to happen. I would look really bad if I did this whole big experiment and it was a complete dud. Just recently in 2021, we found out some bad news about this guy, Dan Ariely. Ariely is an endowed professor at Duke University. He's also, even though he's supposed to be a researcher, if you're a researcher, you're supposed to be an unbiased, objective, or as unbiased and objective as you can be, sort of searcher for the truth, but he's also co-founding companies based on his research. Imagine if you're founding a company, but then you find out there might be problems with your research. See, you're making things complicated by having a financial stake in your research because you're supposed to be only caring about the truth, not about, certain hypotheses and certain theories. He also holds executive positions in a few companies. He loves TED Talks. He's given quite a few TED Talks. And he's released quite a few best-selling books, including one called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. It was a book about why people lie, why people bend the truth. When I made this slide in 2021, this is when the news just dropped, he had been cited 56,829 times across 480 articles. That is very prodigious output for one person to write 480 articles or be part of 480 articles that have been cited by so many other articles. And these are from prestigious journals like Psychological Science, the American Economic Review, JPSB, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or PNAS, the Journal of Experimental Psychology General, all top-tier psychology journals. However, when someone went and looked back at one of his studies, they realized that basically some of the results had been fabricated. So it turned out that there was an insurance company that had given some data, and Ariely spent a lot of time and resources working on this project. And I guess the results weren't exciting enough because he changed the data to have something that's more fitting for a headline. And I guess that's how these people work. They feel like they need to create some big news that's going to get attention, get them into prestigious journals, open a lot of doors, make them eligible for a TED Talk. Maybe they can write a best-selling book. This is all very bad. Apart from going and investigating individual scientists, the replication crisis has also caused people to do something constructive, which is to just say, hey, let's take all the important findings and let's make sure they replicate. So someone already did this study and found that a certain effect that we've been telling everyone, like treat people this way, or here's how you should be doing things based on the research. We shouldn't just say, oh, well, they had statistically significant results, so let's all just do what their results suggest. They said, let's actually go replicate the results. So whenever you go and do this, sometimes the replication rate is not as high as you would like. One major large-scale replication study, they took 100 studies from the 3 top psychology journals, and only 39% of them were judged as having replicated. That's not good. Even if you think that some of these weren't replicated completely correctly, or maybe there have been cultural changes. For instance, the famous Stanley Milgram study on obedience, or the Solomon Asch studies on conformity. Maybe things have changed in our culture, even with those kind of potential caveats in mind. 39% replication rate is not encouraging, but similar studies have found that there are higher rates out there, 62%, 77, 54, 38. You would really want these to be, if science was working the way it should, you would want these to be a lot higher. And what's really discouraging is that while some of these are from psychology journals and economics and neuroscience and whatnot, some of these low replication rates are coming from preclinical cancer research and medical research. So these are scientists who feel like they have a lot on the line and they need to think about their career, and there's more at stake than just their career and just the mere, oh, what's the harm if power pose ends up not being true? Well, I mean, medical research and cancer research, you're producing false cures and wasting people's time on follow-up studies. And once the few studies that do replicate have smaller effects, meaning that if you saw a difference in between groups, like this one, the usual treatment cures depression by 5 units, and the improvement, the new version, improves depression by 10 units, you might find, okay, this replicates, but instead of 5 versus 10, it's now 5 versus 7. Still a difference, but not as big of a difference. And since I'm a cognitive psychologist, I just wanted to point out that when you compare different branches of psychology, cognitive effects are more likely to replicate than social effects. And if you go back and look, a lot of these people were social psychologists. So there is some disciplinary, the blame is not equal to go around. There are certainly cognitive psychologists who probably fudge some numbers at some point, but it seems to be mostly concentrated elsewhere. Which brings me to the culprits. I want you to keep in mind that not all of these people are necessarily outright frauds. One lesson to learn from the replication crisis is that we're realizing just how easy it is for little things like not having double-blind control in your studies, or p-hacking. We now have a name for that. It's called p-hacking, when you reanalyze your results in a bunch of different ways to try and get something that looks like your hypothesis in retrospect to come out the other end. We're becoming more mindful of that, and let's go and look at what are the culprits. So one culprit is that, if people are just trying to produce newsworthy or TED Talk or sexy results, that we usually just didn't try to replicate them in the first place when we probably should have. This is a great quote. Many scientists forge lucrative careers based on their scientific results, producing best-selling books and they're regularly paid 5 or 6-figure sums for lectures, business consulting, and university commencement addresses. So, yeah, there's a lot of money to be made from being seen as a big leader in your field. In general, if you can get a lot of attention, that makes you a valuable commodity. We have something called the attention economy. The money that can be made off of advertisements right now, if you can just get people to pay attention to you on a platform, the ad money to be made off of you is tremendous. And nowadays, even just your data about what you watch and when, if you can get people to sign on to your platform, their data gets transferred over. There's also something called churnalism, which is when you churn out journalism. Journalists don't have time to really vet articles. Something exciting and newsworthy seems to come out. Well, you got to churn out so many articles a week. We're all competing. If you're at Vox or CNN or Fox News, you need to churn out a bunch of entertaining new articles about what's going on in the world of science. Well, we discovered that chocolate causes cancer, or that sex cures your cancer. They're all competing to try and get something out fast to get people's attention. There's not as much time spent on vetting the stuff and asking serious questions about, like, how sophisticated or rigorous was this research. Like I've alluded to many times, there are too many people in the field who are concerned with getting a good job. A lot of times on social media, I follow a lot of people who are finishing up their PhDs, and they're concerned about where they're going to land after the job market. And everyone's always talking about you need to get a tenure track job at an R1. Like if you want to get that good R1 job, this is what you need to do. So basically, there's kind of this assumption that if you don't end up at a research focused university that you're a failure. You need to get a good job. They don't talk about getting a job at a place where you could do some research, but you'd be focused also a lot on teaching, like at LSUA. Until recently, UL Lafayette over in Lafayette was not an R1, which is a designation for having the maximum amount of research focus. There are some universities that are focused more on students and providing service to the community, but there's this in the upper echelons of science and academia, you're seen as not being fully successful if you end up there. So you need to get grants. If you want to get a good job, you have to get grants. If you want grants, you have to look like you produce exciting results, sexy stuff that'll end up in the news. You need to get publications in top tier journals. You can't just get published anymore. You ever hear the phrase publish or perish? Well, now it's publish in the best journals around. I've heard some people say on Twitter, they've said, I've been on hiring committees and I look for that one article that's in a real journal. I don't care if you've published 14 articles, 20 articles while you're in graduate school. You need to publish in a serious journal, and then I'll actually think about reading it and taking you seriously. So it's not just a lot of publications. Having famous friends matters. If you want to, it's very much an insider's game, like many parts of society. And when you do your results, you have to be very good at spinning your results. You have to make them sound like they're very important, even if they're honestly not. I've been talking a lot about citations. If your work gets cited a lot, that is a signal of how valuable your work is seen to be. If you've been cited 100 times, that's great. At least 100 people thought your work was important to reference. But that's not going to get you into the Harvards and the Yales and the, what have you. If you've been cited thousands of times, now that's more impressive. That might open some doors. There are also some incentives to, if you are an institution and one of your researchers has committed fraud, or if you're a journal and you publish an article that that ends up being problematic, that's bad PR. So a lot of people have reported that when they try to report fraud or they try to open up a fraud case, a lot of journals and institutions are very slow and they'll sandbag you and try and discourage you from pushing this too far because it's embarrassing. It makes the whole institution look bad. And then something else you hear a lot is my students need to publish papers to be competitive on the job market and they can't afford to do large scale studies. They need to make do with what they have. And that's another thing is just the expectations are getting higher and higher. These people are, I don't know. It's not a sustainable system to have expectations to keep increasing over the years. To get a job at Stanford in the 70s didn't even necessarily require that you have a publication. One guy, Rosenhan, I believe was his name, got a job at Stanford just because he was about to publish something. He had done a study that people were interested in, and that was good enough to get you in Stanford. I'm not saying standards need to be that low, but standards can't be at their current level, and they can't keep growing like they have been for people to get these positions, because you're just going to turn up the heat on all these people who are coming in through the pipeline who see that they're not going to get at their desired landing spot unless they luck into some good results. What happens if you spend all of your time in grad school on a project and it just doesn't happen to be one of the projects that pans out? Well, the system's not set up to recognize your work. You're just a dud, according to the system's eyes so far. Another problem is access to research. So a top-tier journal like Science gets all of its money from university library subscriptions, even though the people who submit this work usually work at uh, public universities that are paid by the state. And who vets this research, like who actually reads it and provides feedback and makes sure that it's rigorous, peer review, it's a bunch of people who are doing this for free. They're all providing free service and free material to these journals who turn around and make serious bank with virtually no overhead expenses. I mean, they're just emailing documents around and then eventually copywriting it. That's probably the most expensive part of the process, is copywriting the work. And then you can't access it, even though your tax dollars paid for the people working on it to produce the work, and then other people that your tax dollars pay for to evaluate the work and provide criticism and provide quality assurance. That's changing, and I'll get down to that eventually. There's a new thing called open access journals. So with an open access journal, they're not going to, if you try to publish a study and say, hey, I have this new treatment or I have this new thing we can try to help people with, here it is. If they don't think it's sexy enough, a journal like Science is going to say, go take it somewhere else. We only publish really cool, awesome stuff. We curate the best science there is around. An open access journal says, we're going to peer review it. We're going to find people that are going to provide feedback and evaluate it. And we're going to ensure that it is done correctly, that it's scientifically rigorous. But beyond that, you pay us the small copywriting fees, relatively small copywriting fees, and we'll publish it. So there is quality assurance, there is peer review, but we don't care if it's the best, most informative work. So if you publish something in an open access journal, that also means that the public can access it. Anyone can access it. No one is barred from accessing your work. So that's why it's so important to promote open access to research. If you haven't noticed the irony yet, that's intentional. Not the journal is not intentionally doing it, but this caused a kind of a firestorm. This article about open research being locked behind a paywall. So we talked about some of these culprits already. Publication bias. Only statistically significant results get published. So if you spend your time on some results that end up not being significant, you don't get published. That doesn't seem fair in the system, because it's not really up to you which hypotheses end up being true and which ones don't. There's this thing called p-hacking, which I've talked about, where if the result you wanted does not come out the way you predicted, then you can find different ways to test your hypothesis. You massage your data. You try to get your hypothesis to look right in some way or another. It's a lot easier to do this than I'm making it sound. There's something called harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. So if you just go collect some data and you see what came out statistically significant, and then you go and write some hypotheses to make it sound like that's what you always thought would happen, and it makes sense, and you write this whole story framing like, since the beginning of time, man has always wondered why this doesn't cause this, and this happens all the time. And some old papers I've read, especially in social psychology, have had these weird kind of, like, I understand what you did with your study, I understand the results, but I don't understand your prediction. I don't understand how you came up with this weird hypothesis, and I don't understand how that hypothesis makes any logical sense. In retrospect, it kind of looks like they just collected some data and then wrote a story about why they expected that all along. That's called harking. Another problem with the replication crisis is small samples. Whenever you collect a small sample, most people realize that you have low statistical power. At least they know on an intuitive level that if there is a real effect to be detected, that if you have a small sample, you might not actually be able to detect that effect. For instance, if it turns out that drinking diet soda on average will make you not grow as tall, like your height will be slightly diminished, like you're nutritionally challenged, Well, your height is affected by all kinds of factors. So you wouldn't be able to do a study of like 12 people who drink diet soda and 12 people who don't and see a real difference in their height, because such a small effect is going to be hidden by all the noise of all the different things, the other things that have an effect on your height. But the opposite is also true. If you collect a small sample, you're you have an increased chance of observing something that isn't real, but because you collected such a small sample, you get such odd results. So what do I mean by that? If you flip a coin 4 times, it's actually not that unlikely to get heads 4 times in a row or tails 4 times in a row. Um, in fact, what is the probability of that happening? Let me check real quick. Whoops. So that would be zero point 0.5 to the fourth power. That's a six, just a little bit above a 6% chance of happening. 6%'s not that crazy low of a percent. I mean, if a bunch of people do a small sample experiment like that, just 4 flips, you might end up concluding, like, oh, this coin is loaded because I flipped it and I got the same result 4 times in a row. The same thing scales up. When you do a small study, you'll get these extreme unlikely results just by a fluke. Like if you had flipped the coin more times, you would see, oh, it was just those first 4 that just by luck and happenstance just happened to be all heads or all tails. Now that I've flipped the coin 300 times, that streak has been washed out by all the other outcomes. Same thing with depression. If you try something to help people with depression, you got a control group where you didn't do the new treatment, and you have a new treatment group where you did try the new treatment, and your treatment appears to work, well, you only looked at 12 people versus 12 other people. Any sample that small can just easily show you an extreme outcome that might have happened anyway, regardless of what you were doing. That's why you need big samples to really wash out these different possibilities. And I've been talking about proper randomization, control, double blind. So people need to be randomly assigned to conditions. If you think that, let's say, people do better on exams in the afternoon versus the morning, you can't just go to a morning class and give them an exam and go to an afternoon class and give them an exam and see who did better. That's not randomized. The people who signed up for the early morning class might be different in some way from the people who were in the afternoon class. You have to randomly assign people to take the exam in the morning or in the afternoon, because otherwise there's other differences that you haven't accounted for. You have to control variables. You have to have a comparison between a control group and experimental group, and the people collecting the data, double blind. You can't know what group people are going to be in. You ever heard about the study where the teachers develop these opinions about students, like they think some students are dumb and some students are smart, and then all of their experiences afterwards just seem to confirm that, because we're biased observers. You don't want biased observers, or people that have hopes for certain hypotheses coming out correctly, looking at the results. The people recording the data should not know what's going on. They should just be recording numbers, recording data. And in general, I've been talking about this a lot, but it's worth belaboring the point that if you're not seen as a success in academia, if you're a researcher, people won't take your research as seriously, and many theories are good theories, but they end up not being true. Many theories end up being true, but we didn't test it the right way, or we didn't come up with a clever enough test. If you end up being one of the unlucky people who had a good theory, but you just ended up being wrong, or maybe you weren't using the right methods, then the system just labels you as a dud, and now you're left behind relative to your other colleagues who lucked their way into a more successful project. Now we just have a few more slides about this. So another culprit might be a lack of diversity. One thing I found interesting is that when you go look at all the people who have committed fraud and been exposed for fraud lately, there was only one woman. among them. Everyone else was men. And I'm not saying men are inherently dishonest or that men are just so ambitious and have such a big ego that that trumps like other things, but not just in my own personal review that I've stated here, but when you go look at all the fraudsters, all the people who have been uncovered, there's just one woman. Everything else is a man. It's interesting, but then again, we also have problems in the system where most people in academia are white men anyway. So it might just be a base rate problem where really there aren't, maybe people from other groups would also be doing this if there was just more of them we don't see. I don't know. There's also this article. I encourage you to go read it. It's very interesting. It's by Duarte and colleagues. They argue that there's not enough political diversity in social psychology. This is kind of getting off topic, actually, but not really, because social psychologists are all very left leaning politically, and while that's a separate issue from being fraudulent, um, it doesn't really make sense for everyone working on a complex problem like social dynamics to all have so many shared assumptions. There should arguably be people who view human behavior from a variety of different perspectives, arguing with each other and doing studies to try and, you know, we want peer review, we want competition, we want the marketplace of ideas, we want the best ideas to survive. We want to subject ideas to scrutiny, and if they can survive scrutiny, they're free to stay. If they can't, then they have to leave. That seems like how it should work. If you read this article, there's some pretty compelling arguments that that's not how it's working right now. There's also some very interesting replies. If you can find a version of this paper where you have people, this happens every now and then. If you release a real spicy article like this, that people will be invited to comment on it and like publish their commentaries. It's a very interesting read. I encourage anyone who's interested to go check it out. If you remember me talking about Psychological Science, that's the journal. Psychological Science has been doing arguably the most to try and combat these problems with the replicability and fraudulent data. So they have these badges that they'll put on publications. One of them is the open data badge. So if you're willing to go and post your data somewhere so someone can go and look at it, you'll be more accountable. That's how some people are caught. You just go look at their data and you can tell that it was fabricated. I have at least for my major projects, I have my data up in a repository so that if anyone has any doubts about my research, they can go look at my data. That doesn't stop people from just putting fake data up, and you can't always detect fake data, but it's something to make people feel more accountable. There's open materials, so you can't really replicate someone's study if you don't have the exact stimuli they were using. And then there's something called pre-registration. Pre-registration is where you basically put a time-stamped documentation online saying what your hypotheses were before you do the study. You say what you expect your results to be. That way, you can't come in after the fact and pretend that you had different hypotheses. When your hypotheses fail or when your predictions fail, I mean, everyone knows you did a pre-registered report. And Psychological Science is trying to acknowledge people for doing that and encourage that behavior. And I talked about nonprofit journals, also called open journals. Their job isn't to try and go and find the best research to try and up their own profile. Their job is just to make sure that your research is done correctly and is rigorous, and that's it. They're not trying to publish the best of the best. Just if it's science, you can get published. So that's part of it. And there's also kind of a cultural shift. All this stuff I was talking about kind of started in the late 2009, 8, 10, especially in the 2010s. It became more and more apparent. And I'd say the culture has shifted a lot. People are a lot more wary and skeptical. They want to see something replicated before they go make a big stink about it. If you see any researchers coming up with a pipeline who are making a big deal out of their research, if anything, that's going to make people skeptical. Skepticism's good, right? Skepticism can be mean and off base, but in general, science is supposed to be skeptical. So that culture shift is good. You want to praise people for doing this kind of stuff and blame them if they're not doing this stuff. I have a few things about sample size and effect size that I already talked about. I moved these, but I kind of talked about them already. I shouldn't have moved them. And then, yeah, sample sizes. This is just from Psychological Science. This is data I just went and collected casually. I just grabbed random articles from the 90s up until today, a few years ago, and tracked like are sample sizes getting bigger because you want to be able to detect effects. And it seems like there's kind of an overall increase, but it's kind of a weird trend. Like they're increasing, but at a weird rate. Like they're either like going out of control real big, real fast, or some of them are actually still not even that large. So that's all I'm going to talk about for part one. Part two, I'm going to talk about big data and implications for your careers. So keep a lookout for that.